Good afternoon. So, we're going to talk a little bit about orchestra seating. Specifically, I'm going to focus on how the strings in an orchestra sit, which is really what tends to vary from orchestra to orchestra. Most orchestras use what we call a traditional seating, meaning if you're looking at an orchestra from left to right, the strings are organized from highest to lowest. So the first violins will be on your left, followed by the seconds, the violas, the cellos, and then the basses are actually behind the cellos. Now, I say traditional seating with the quotes because that didn't actually become the norm until the 20th century. This type of seating was popularized by a conductor named Leopold Stokowski, who was actually an English conductor with a kind of a fake Central European accent. Stokowski liked to experiment with different seating arrangements, and this is one that actually stuck. Prior to that, composers as late as Tchaikovsky and Mahler were still writing with what we call a classical seating arrangement in mind. This meant antiphonal violins used as a sort of 18th century stereo type of effect. So, again, from your left to right, the orchestra would be seated first violins, then cellos, then violas, and then second violins. So the violins would actually be sort of facing across each other, and the basses would actually be lined across the back of the orchestra. So if you're looking at the orchestra, the basses are all the way back behind the rest of them. So why? Well, if you look at the scores of pieces written from the classical period all the way through the very early 20th century, you would notice that the violins are often in a kind of a dialogue with each other rather than in unison or octaves or as a sort of a counterpoint, as they often are in 20th century music. In a less than stellar concert hall, this classical seating with the sort of antiphonal violins this way, it's not ideal regardless of the composer's intentions, simply because the violins are placed too far apart to be able to hear each other very well. So we compromise and often go with a traditional seating, which places them right next to each other. After all that, what's my personal preference? In general, if the hall is good enough, I like to use the seating that I believe best reflects the composer's intentions. I also have a particular affinity for cellos and basses being placed closer to the center of an orchestra for the added depth of sound. It's kind of like turning up the subwoofer on your stereo system. Again, from your left to right, that would look like this: the first violins, then the second violins, then the cellos, and then the violas, and I actually like the basses across the back so that that cello bass sound is coming directly off the stage at the audience. Now, in these really kind of unusual times, what's next? Well, obviously, the health of our musicians and of our audience is paramount. Beyond that, it's really an issue of space. And our repertoire going forward will have to be very carefully selected with that in mind. How many audience members can we safely fit into a performance space? How many musicians? And the types of instruments are also a factor. Wind and brass instruments, as you may have guessed, are very different or have very different considerations than strings and percussion, since air actually has to pass through and out of those instruments in order for them to produce sound. Luckily, the research is being done, and we have a wealth of really terrific, beautiful music written for solo and small ensembles. On top of that, living, breathing composers are writing music specifically for these weird times, even as we speak. There's also a number of quality reductions, as we call them, of works originally meant for much larger forces. Those just have to be policed pretty carefully to ensure that they're not robbing the original work or works on which they're based of their integrity. So that's, in a nutshell, the reason why orchestras sit the way they do, my personal preference for how an orchestra should sit, and sort of the path I see forward as far as live orchestral performance is concerned. I hope it was helpful.